All right. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 13 this morning. And so if you will turn in your Bibles there, 1 Samuel chapter 13. I still have some handouts left. If anybody does not have the question sheet for 1 Samuel 13, raise your hand and I will get one to you. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 13. You got it? Okay, all right. No problem. And should have got a volunteer to do this. All right. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 13. And I'll have some more handouts at the end of class. In 1 Samuel 11 and 12, we kind of saw the initial part of Saul's reign. And how would we characterize the first part of Saul's reign? Positive, yeah. Saul was initially a success. He wins battles and demonstrates some general spiritual insight. He's merciful towards his detractors. But 1 Samuel 13, 14, and 15 describe how Saul was rejected as king. And really, we should view chapters 13, 14, and 15 kind of together as a unit. We're not going to cover them in a single class because there's a lot of detail I want to get into. But in the context of his wars with the nations, Saul does not do very well. And this section begins and ends with a confrontation with Samuel. In chapter 13, Samuel confronts Saul, tells him that he has been disobedient and that the Lord has rejected him as king, is taking his kingship away and giving it to a man after his own heart. In chapter 15, the same thing happens. Samuel confronts Saul, says, "You have disobeyed the commandment of the Lord. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor who is better than you." That is what, that scene really happens twice. Samuel confronts Saul on two occasions with this idea. And why does it need to be twice? Well, maybe the Lord decided to give Saul a second chance. Maybe it's just to reaffirm this idea. But just as Saul was appointed by Samuel as king 3 times, he's actually rejected by Samuel as king 3 times. In chapter 13, in chapter 15, and then at the very end, in chapter 28, when Samuel comes back from the dead to tell him, "The Lord has rejected you as king, and you will be dead tomorrow." And so there's that approach as well. That brings us to chapter 13, and I guess we'll start by reading the first 14 verses. Somebody read the first 14 verses, please. All right. All right, so there's a few things that we can look at in this section. First of all, in verse 1, I asked the question, how long did Saul reign as king? And then I had a very extensive comment in brackets. You might want to look at some different translations on this point. What did you learn when you compared the versions? Okay, that's right. The book of Acts tells us that Saul reigned for 40 years in Acts chapter 13 and verse 21. The New Testament Saul, who is also called Paul, says that in a sermon that he gives. What else did you learn? You learned that without even looking at another Bible version. Anybody actually consult other translations like I asked her? No. All right. Well, I'll just kind of give a gambit here, run a list of some of the things that are out there. My version says that Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. That's the New American Standard. There are several other versions that follow that approach. The NIV, the New Living Translation, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. The ESV says that Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, blah, 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 this is what happened. The King James kind of follows that same route. The ASV says Saul was 40 years old when he began to reign, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, ... Basically the same as the King James, but they don't say that Saul was 1, they say he was 40 in that instance. There's some versions don't have anything. They say Saul was, and then there's a blank. Saul was blank years old when he became king, and he reigned 2 years over Israel. And on and on. The Septuagint actually just omits verse 13 altogether. I think they got a headache with it. The problem is that in the Hebrew text there are no actual numbers, and there's a lot of confusion as to what to do with this. It literally says that he was the son of a year when he began to reign, but no number is specified. And I think it highly unlikely that Saul became king at the age of 1. Just because, he goes out and fights a battle against the Ammonites. He's head and shoulders above everybody else when he's appointed king. It's not likely that that's what's going on here. We have also what Paul says. Saul reigned for 40 years. His reign was not 2 years, like some would say again. And Josephus, the historian Josephus, has him in one place. Josephus says he reigned 40 years. In another place, Josephus says he reigned 20 years. So there's disagreement among... Even in Paul's day, there seems to be disagreement among the historians of what was going on. Now, what do we do with that? Where does it say that? I think it says that. I was like, I hope if that would solve all my problems if it said that, but no, it was David. David reigned 40 years, and Solomon reigned 40 years, and Saul reigned 40 years. The New American Standard has 42 years. I'm inclined to go with the New Testament. I think Paul knew what he was talking about personally. So we follow what Paul said. We're usually on pretty sure footing. Every time the Bible talks about a king, you'll find this kind of formula in there. He was such and such years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for this many years. And you see that with David, you see that with Solomon, you see that with most of the kings in the divided kingdom period. But one theory that's been put forth is that whoever was writing Samuel started writing the formula, goes, I don't have the numbers anywhere, and just left a blank there and never filled it in. And so it got transmitted that way down to us. What can we learn from that? Well, Saul's actual age of beginning to reign is lost to us. And I think it tells us something. Inspiration does not demand that God give us all the information, does it? It does not demand that God give us even the things that we're curious about. And we have to be content with that fact. John? Exactly, yeah. And so, I mean, that's just kind of the main reason for asking that question, is to get us to realize that, the Lord doesn't necessarily look at chronological precision as the main reason why He's putting this forth. He doesn't look at, I've got to give all this precise data. And so we shouldn't get unhinged over something like this. Yeah, there is. Mark?
I think this also proves that it's accurate. If everything was laid out, when a police officer goes to, say, a traffic accident, he has 4 witnesses what happened, and they all tell exactly the same story. There's something wrong with that. They're all going to tell a little bit of a different story because they all saw it. Right?
Yes.
4 different people. So the fact that we have these little glitches actually shows that probably were accurate than not, because if it was all laid out as perfect, it would have to be down the line.
I mean, it is interesting to me that the scribes didn't feel the urge to make up a number. Well, we don't know what to do. We make up a number. Well, I mean, in this case, the New American Standard translators did make up numbers. Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign. There's no real textual basis for that. That's just a guess, is what it is. But things like that, again, the fact that there is disagreement on that, in some ways is actually encouraging, because it shows that, this isn't something that was just monolithically handed down to us by some kind of, ulterior conspiracy. This is something that, people labored over and fought over and, for lack of a better term, did research on. We know that the Bible contains research because Luke tells us in Luke chapter 1. That doesn't necessarily override inspiration. All right, so enough about disputes about genealogies and chronologies and things like that. Let's move on. Now, in verses 2 through 7, the Philistines show up, and this is the main threat that Saul was kind of put in power. This is one of the main threats Saul was put in power to address. So how did they begin addressing the Philistine threat? How do Saul and Israel respond to it? Yes. All right. So there's a garrison in Geba, and Jonathan smites it. Now, and in verse 4, again, they learn the same thing. All Israel heard this, and they were summoned to Saul. But back up a little bit even. Verse 2. How do they put this army together? Saul chose them for himself. And how many people did Saul choose? 3,000. Would nobody else come out to fight it? Jonathan had 1,000. Saul had 2,000. Okay. Saul sent away the rest of the people. But so he could have had a larger army than he did, right? So why did he send away everybody? He wanted 3,000. Well, why not get a bigger army? Bigger armies are better, right? Actually, God did command this in the law. Yeah. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, in verses 1 through 9, it says that when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. And in this case, there's no mention of a priest, but, what happens, he says to them, "Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. The officers shall also speak to the people, saying, Who is the man that has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle and another man would dedicate it. Who is the man that has planted a vineyard and has not begun to use it? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in battle and another man would begin to use its fruit. And who is the man that is engaged to a woman and has not married her? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle and another man should marry her." And then the officer should speak further to the people and say, "Who is the man that is afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's hearts melt like his heart. Does this sound like a good, from a secular standpoint, does that sound like a good military strategy? Let's reduce our manpower. Let's get rid of all the people that have commitments. Let's get rid of all the people that are afraid, and let's just go with this small group here. From a secular standpoint, that is a terrible plan. But it is the Lord's plan for battle, because the Lord has a different standard for giving victory. And so, in this section of the chapter, I don't think Saul does anything wrong in sending these men away. He's actually following what the law says. Done. Yeah. Yes, Keith. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yeah, the New Testament affirms that the real battle is the spiritual one against the devil himself and against all of his minions. Now, there is a shift that takes place, though. We read chapter 13, and Saul starts out, he keeps his army fairly reduced, and compared to the Philistines, he's outnumbered big time. But by the time we get to the end of chapter 14, the end of the battle, we have this statement that is made. In verse 52, the war against the Philistines was severe all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any mighty man or any valiant man, he attached him to his staff. Just kind of a little detail, and I only noticed this just this week, but something changes between the beginning of chapter 13 and the end of chapter 14. Something changes about Saul. He goes from following the Lord's instructions about forming an army to going more of kind of a secular strategy of let's get anybody and everybody. Let's form the dream team, the best and let's get the biggest army we can get. Anybody who I can recruit, I will recruit and draft into this army. Right. Yeah. Right, and it's the thing that's... Yes, Mark. Sorry.
In the story, the lack of Saul's faith, not waiting for the sacrifice. Ask, more shall be given. The man who has faith, God will give him faith. The man who does not have faith, has shall be given. So Saul is the example of that.
Yeah. And now in preparing for battle, Saul's army, suddenly we learn the Philistine numbers in verse 5, and they're big. 30,000 chariots. Saul has 3,000 men total in his army. The Philistines outnumber, the Philistines have 10 chariots for every one man in the Israelite army. Those are not good odds. Not from the human standpoint. And do you know what starts to happen? As the days wear on, Saul's army gets smaller. Smaller. Because people are deserting. And we don't learn what the number is until we get to verse 15, actually. But there's only 600 people left by the time this is all settled. What does this remind us of? This army that just decreases and decreases in size right before battle. Does that remind us of any other story we've read? Right, it does kind of remind us of Gideon, doesn't it? And the Lord, now, with Gideon, it was at the Lord's instruction that the army decreased. Here, people are deserting. But it's the same principle applies. We're kind of like being set up, okay, Saul's going to be like Gideon now. We've seen parallels between Saul and Gideon before. And, okay, we're going to have this small army and they're going to rout the Philistines and they're going to win this battle. But that's not how it works. Because Saul does something very foolish in these verses. And the story goes differently. Saul's at Gilgal. He's waiting 7 days. Anybody remember where Samuel told Saul to do that? Oh, yeah, sure. Well, that is, I think he's rallying his troops there at Gilgal. I mean, it's the people that are abandoning him at that particular point. I don't know if we could take Saul remaining at Gilgal necessarily as a criticism. You know, I mean, some of the Israelites are still following him, trembling is what it is. Yeah.
But the thing is, he's not urgent. The Lord is our hand. Lord. Oh.
Well, I mean, let's... Dennis, you have something? Where is that reference, huh? I did not pick up on that. Chapter 9... What, did somebody say the verse number? I like that. That's a... I'm sorry? 11. So see here, he's coming to the city. The people have a sacrifice. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I like that. That's a good point. No, I mean, but that's the problem in this story, isn't it? Saul won't wait on Samuel. And ultimately, in chapter 14, we're going to see he doesn't wait on the Lord either. This is his big issue throughout all of this. Now, in chapter 10, in verse 8, Samuel had given some instruction to Saul, wait 7 days at Gilgal until I come and offer the sacrifice. Now, whether he's referring to this event, or whether he's referring to some other event, and this is just, it's clear the same scenario is going on. Saul is supposed to wait 7 days for Samuel to show up. And 7 days go by, and they're in the seventh day, and no Samuel. So Saul offers the sacrifice. What is it? And let's ask this question. What was Saul's sin here? He didn't follow God's instructions through the prophet. Yes, and the main issue here is, he doesn't do what Samuel said. Don? Yes. Right. And the problem is ultimately in his heart, I think. I want to talk briefly about another explanation that's sometimes put forth, and no one's brought it up, so I'm going to bring it up. But there's a common explanation that what Saul's really doing here is violating the priestly office. Only priests could offer sacrifice, and Saul couldn't do that, so he broke that rule. That explanation is out there. And there's a kind of a parallel with Uzziah going into the holy place to offer incense in 2 Chronicles 26. Now, I will say this. There is no passage in the law that says only the Levites can offer sacrifice. For that matter, then we have to deal with Gideon, who offered sacrifices at God's instructions. We have to deal with Manoah and his wife, who were Danites, who offered sacrifices at the angel of the Lord's instruction. We have to deal with Job, who wasn't even an Israelite for that matter, and offered burnt offerings and sacrifices. We have to deal with David and Solomon, who offered numerous burnt offerings and sacrifices, and are never rebuked for it in any context the way that Saul was. And in fact, God is moved by David's sacrifice to save the people in 2 Samuel 24 and verse 25, and rewards Solomon for his in 1 Kings chapter 3, rewards him with wisdom by coming to him in a dream and saying, I'm going to give you whatever you want. And then, of course, we have to deal with Samuel himself, who wasn't even a priest. Where's his job offering sacrifices? Well, all that to say, the problem is not the sacrifice itself. The problem is not that the problem is that he disobeyed. He violated Samuel's instructions. And he disobeyed under the pretext of sacrificing. Well, better to disobey and offer a sacrifice than to obey and not offer the sacrifice. That is Saul's philosophy. Saul has it backwards. And no. Well, it's the other way around. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel makes this point to him very emphatically. As the Lord is much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. The main issue is not usurping the role of the priest. The main issue is Saul's failure to wait on God. His heart is in the wrong place. How does Saul justify himself? How does he explain himself? You didn't show up when you said you were. Okay, so he blames Samuel. What else? The Philistines are coming. Okay, I'm scared. He becomes afraid of the Philistines. My army's deserting me. What does he say? The people are running away. He blames the people. This is not the last time Saul will blame the people for his disobedience. Yeah. So he blames Samuel, he blames the people, he blames the Philistines. He doesn't blame himself. That's true. Well, no, he does say one thing about himself. He says, I forced myself. I forced myself. Now, there's the... sorry, yes, I've got blinders.
That woman that you gave me.
Yeah, that's right. Saul... all this stuff, and what gets me is in verse 10, he goes out to greet Samuel. Like everything's okay. He goes out, greet Samuel. Oh, everything's going fine over here, Samuel. He was. Chapter 15, he kind of does something similar. He comes out to greet Samuel. He says, blessed is the Lord. I've fulfilled the commandment of the Lord. Well, the truth is that he hasn't done any such thing, and Samuel calls him on it. Saul also blames the people in chapter 15, too. We're going to see that later. But what gets me is this statement, I forced myself. Did Saul not know what he was doing was wrong? Yes, situational ethics. I forced myself. I knew it was wrong, but I forced myself because, you and the people and the Philistines, and I was scared and all this other stuff. The fact that Saul makes the statement, I forced myself, shows he knew it was wrong and he did it anyway. He forced himself to do what was wrong. These excuses were sufficient in his mind to justify disobedience. Saul's real problem is in his heart. Because he did what he knew was wrong because doing what was right was too difficult. It was not convenient. He was just trying to seek God's favor, yeah. But he wasn't. Because the fact he did what he knew was wrong, what does that say about his heart? What does it say about any of our hearts? When we do what we know is wrong, we know something is wrong, and we do it anyway, what does that say about our hearts? Really? That's right. Numbers chapter 15 talks about that. Saul has not obeyed God's commandment. And Samuel's reaction to this, or God's reaction to this, is what? You're being cut off. You can no longer be king. You have acted foolishly. You have not obeyed God's commandment, which he commanded you. Samuel, yes? Right, well, yeah. In this case, of course, his intentions were ultimately double-minded. And, his result ultimately derails itself in the long term as well. There's something to that. we can try to do the thing that looks religious or looks pious. But if it is not what the Lord has commanded, it is not the thing we ought to do. Kind of like the Pharisees, kind of like, well, we could be like that too, for that matter. We can know what is wrong, we can know what is wrong and still do it anyway because, well, in our mind we have somehow justified it, or we have somehow even praised it in our mind to make it something that is a good thing. Exactly. Now Samuel informs Saul of what could have been here. Your kingdom could have endured forever. Your kingdom could have been established. Same term that's later used of David and his kingdom being established in 2 Samuel 5 and 7. This is the first time in the book that we've heard about an enduring kingdom in any sense. The king wasn't just going to be a provisional measure. It was going to be something that lasted forever, God said. But you have messed that up, Saul. You went and messed that up, and now I'm going to have to go get someone else. I'm going to have to get a man after my own heart. This is the first and only place in Samuel where the expression "a man after God's own heart" is used, by the way. And later on in Acts chapter 13, in verse 22, Paul actually links the expression with, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. But he's connecting passages together when he says that. Because, at no point in Samuel does it say David was the man after God's own heart. We have to infer that by connecting different passages together in Samuel. Something about how, you can join contexts together if it is appropriate. It's not always, sometimes you'll hear people complain, oh, you're taking that verse out of context. And while I believe we ought to respect context, by all means, we also need to realize that, the context is not limited to itself. It does extend, to a greater biblical context as well. There's a similar thing that's later said to Jeroboam. Ahijah prophesied to Jeroboam that if you obey the Lord's commandments, you will get an enduring kingdom, like the house of David. Well, Jeroboam doesn't do that. He builds golden calves at Bethel and Dan, and the kingdom is taken away from him and given to someone else, who then is taken away from him. Israel never had a good king in the northern tribes. It just never went well for them. Jeroboam disobeyed God's command, and in many ways is like Saul. Instead, God seeks out someone else. In Jeremiah chapter 3, in verse 15, there's also an expression, God will seek out shepherds after my own heart. Now, ultimately, of course, who is the true king after God's own heart? Jesus, yes. So it goes beyond David. It goes also to Jesus. And that's kind of the implicit point of Acts chapter 13. Okay, any comments or questions down to the end of verse 14 in Samuel's speech? Okay, I want to finish up the chapter real quick. Can I get a volunteer to read verses 15 to 23? Okay. Now, just to kind of visualize this whole thing. All right, Philistines are camped here at Michmash, right here. Jonathan has struck the garrison at Geba. He did that earlier in the chapter. They're only a couple miles away. The Philistines are gathering here. This is where Geba is. Philistines send troops to Ophrah. They send troops to Beth Horon. And they send troops in this direction as well, towards the valley of Zeboim. What are they trying to do? Huh? Ditch removing. They're kind of trying to flank them and surround them here, it looks like. And, cut off every route of escape and all that. This is the Philistine battle strategy to take Geba. So, Israel's getting kind of surrounded, getting a little claustrophobic there. The Philistines outnumber them heavily. Okay, we're going to top all this off. We got Michmash. Well, they've got superior numbers. They've got a superior position, and they've actually got the higher ground. And we learn in chapter 14. Oh, and by the way, what else? Only 2 swords of the whole army. What is wrong with us? Exactly. There is no blacksmith in Israel in those days, and some of it's a historical problem. At this point in history, nations are still transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and Israel hasn't really quite made that transition yet. And the Philistines, they've monopolized on the metal because they didn't want Israel building swords or spears or weapons of mass destruction. It's just not going to happen here. If the Philistines had to get... if the Israelites had to get their farming tools sharpened, they got to go to the Philistines. And they got to pay 2/3 of a shekel. I don't know for certain, but I think that's about $7 in our currency today. So it's not horribly expensive, but it's kind of like I got to go to these guys to get my tools sharpened. Militarily, what does this mean for Israel militarily? They're in trouble. They're sunk. It's time for a miracle. Spiritually, what does the lack of a blacksmith mean? Nothing. That's right. Got the answer to that question that I threw in there. Yeah, nothing. God does not need Israel to have swords or spears to win the fight. God has used the natural elements to win the battle before. Jericho was taken without all of this fancy military technology. Israel does not need better weapons. They don't need superior numbers. And they don't really need better position. What they need is the Lord. And this is another chance. This is another chance for Saul to rise to the occasion and lead the nation. But that's not what happens. What happens instead is somebody else rises up and kind of takes the lead and has the correct attitude about this. In chapter 14 and verse 6, it is Jonathan who said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." Now that's pretty good perspective he's got there. And, as we end this, I'll just think on this note that, the Lord is seeking out a man after His own heart. He hasn't said who it is yet. And somebody might have been scratching their head going, well, maybe it's Jonathan. Maybe Saul's going to be deposed by his son or something like that. But we learn that that's not the story that God has in mind either as we read further into the text. Don. Yes, he does. And we're going to see more of that as we get into chapters, into subsequent chapters and into relationship with David and all those other things. Of course, we learn ultimately Jonathan was not the man after God's own heart that he had in mind at all. It was David. And Jonathan, in spite of his great faith in the Lord, becomes collateral damage for Saul's bad behavior. Just goes to show, your sins do affect other people, even people that are good and righteous surrounding you. Always be mindful of that. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 13. That is not a good chapter division, by the way, because the story continues into chapter 14 with the actual battle proper. I have handouts for next time, so unless there's any comments or questions, we're going to pick up with chapter 14 on Thursday.